And let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on why Azure is right for your business. I'm going to hand things over now to our Microsoft Product Manager, David Mulkey.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here with you all today during our Microsoft Product Focus Month. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We're going to have an in-depth discussion about why Azure is right for your business today. We're hosting several webinars over the month of March covering some of our most popular topics from Microsoft, and I believe we have just 2 after today's session remaining. So please check out our website to see our past webinars or to register for any of our future webinars. So today's session, like we said, is going to be about why Azure is right for your business. Cloud technology is key to the digital transformation. Joining us today is Mr. Eric Blant. He's going to walk us through some of the reasons why Azure is right for your business. Eric has served as an IT manager for 5 years and has been a certified trainer since 2001, earning one of our top tier spots as a trainer with New Horizons Computer Learning Centers. So he brings a lot of real world experience to you today. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Eric Bland. Eric, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thanks a lot there. Well, hopefully y'all are having some nice weather. Just a little bit more about me, just so you know where I'm coming from and where some of the information or the flavoring on the information. I am a trainer down at the New Horizons in New Orleans, Louisiana. We're a little cloudy today, but nice temperatures. Sorry about that if you're out east and still getting snow. My experience throughout the years, and I've been in Microsoft networking now since, the NT days easily. But I worked in small businesses. And so a lot of my experience in data centers were small data centers that I built myself from the ground up. And then transition on over into teaching. And actually, when the cloud services started coming out a few years ago, I looked at that and said, there's not going to be any small business anywhere in the country that's going to do data centers themselves anymore. Everybody's going to be jumping into the cloud. And it turns out it's not just small businesses that are doing that, but medium-sized and large businesses all are jumping into the cloud because of some of the advantages. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about today. Why should I get out into the cloud? And just by the way, you can see some of my certifications there. I am an MCT. I have the MCSEs for Windows Server and some of the other associated products like Exchange Server, System Center. I do hold the MCSA Cloud certification, which means that I'm certified both in Azure and in Office 365, which is actually run inside of Microsoft's own Azure data centers, and a few other certifications that I've picked up along the way. One of the things with Microsoft is they do require that you're certified in whatever it is that you teach. So I have the Azure certification. I have the Azure certification from infrastructure. There is a separate developer track. And that is not where I've been throughout my work career. So developers are the people that I support. Now, first of all, what are we using the cloud for? And a lot of organizations are using the cloud to create new apps and new services that they are broadly distributing to either their employee base, if their employee base is spread out through a large area, or in fact worldwide. Or to your customers, so that you can have better interaction with your customers no matter where they are around the world. You may be using cloud computing for storing, backup, or recovery of data. Down here in New Orleans, we had a problem a few years ago where had cloud computing been as big as it is today, would have made life a lot easier for a lot of people. A couple of years later, out on the East Coast, we had Sandy, and of course you have out in the West, the past couple of years, we've had trouble with widespread fires, and God forbid that there would be an earthquake event or some other large-scale event. Actually here in New Orleans, a lot of the small businesses in particular had utilized a service that had bought up there was a Federal Reserve Bank here in New Orleans. It's gone now, been gone for quite a few years, but an enterprising company took it over and use it for offsite backup storage. And that was a great option for that building, very secure building. It did not flood during Katrina. It did not get damaged in any way during Katrina. Probably it eventually ran out of power, although I'd have to give it that, the whole city. But what people hadn't anticipated was that the entire city would end up being cut off and nobody could get back in. We had 4 to 6 weeks of practically no access and people sneaking in and getting to their backup tapes and carting them up to nearby cities. Baton Rouge happened to be where I ended up. Because the company I worked for at the time had an office in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and I can remember the building that we were in was a twin building, and the other building was largely empty. And so for months afterwards, we'd see cars just pulling up with equipment loading in and backup tapes and loading in. But initially, nobody could get to anything because the whole city had gotten cut off. And you might be thinking, oh, well, that's a unique problem to New Orleans, but it's not. Large-scale disasters could happen. They don't happen very often. Sometimes I teach project management. One of the things we talk about is risk, and how a risk is an uncertainty, but in order to quantify it, you have to determine what could happen and what are the chances of it happening. And I can remember for years saying, there's always something like a meteor hit that would be total devastation, but the chances of it happening are so small that you really don't spend much time thinking about it. Well, I used to say that, and then a couple of years ago, there was that meteor explosion over parts of Russia that caused a lot of damage. I had to start thinking about that again. Maybe my estimation of the actual probability of something like that happening was a little underestimated. There are other things that could happen in an area. We have nuclear power plants. Look at what happened in Japan, where a large area ends up unusable. Look at Russia or the Ukraine, where you've got a large area that's been largely cleaned out because of an industrial accident. So storing backup and recovery of data in the cloud is a perfect solution. Now, in fact, after Katrina, I can remember a lot of the small businesses that I ultimately ended up being their IT guy as a trainer. The company I worked for at the time also lent me out as a consultant, which is what they did with all their trainers. So I actually went from being an IT guy, a single IT guy at a small business, and then another small business. I went to being the one and only IT guy at a bunch of small businesses. And that's what I was advising people at the time was, can you partner up with another small business that is far enough away that you could have backups or an alternate data center, even though you're not big enough to actually afford that? And the cloud just takes care of that whole problem. We have options to restore in the cloud. We have options to restore to an alternate site. Your choice on that, all through Azure. If you're producing websites that need to be accessed by people across a wide area, why not host them in a service that's worldwide available? Maybe you find some value in blogging. And being able to post a blog, but it's not in some commercial blog site. It's your own internal site, so that you can distribute the information either internally or again to your customers. If you're going to be doing some form of internet service, why not host it in the internet itself? That way you don't have to worry about the communications, the bandwidth that comes into your data center. You're hosting yourself out in an area that's got a huge amount of bandwidth available and has a very high availability guarantee that goes with it. Audio and video. If you've ever been involved with having to stream audio or video from your own equipment, you know what difficulty that presents to you. First of all, do you have equipment that's up to the challenge of getting hammered by a lot of people? Typically when you have information in an audio or video format, when it's first produced, it gets a lot of traffic. And then, of course, it trails off over time. But do you have sufficient capacity in your equipment? Do you have sufficient capacity in your bandwidth to support that big hit right after you produce something that you typically want to get out there right now? And yeah, you're going to leave it up for historical purposes, but usually it has a bigger impact on your business right away. So do you have a way to provide the amount of service at a reasonable cost? And then if you go ahead and you buy larger equipment, or you buy a larger chunk of bandwidth, how is that going to affect you over the long term? Did you just buy a lot of equipment that you don't really need except for a short term? Did you have to sign up for a lot of bandwidth over a longer period of time in order to be able to even get it in the first place? You know, I've faced that in small businesses where I might have had a temporary need for some extra bandwidth, but it wasn't available on a temporary basis. It was available as part of my contract with the provider. So do I even have the capability of ramping up temporarily, or am I going to end up paying for something that, yeah, I might need it now and I might need it next quarter or next, in 6 months, but I don't need it consistently. So cloud computing can help answer that problem. Software delivery or app delivery. If you it seems like everybody's got a smartphone now, and so every business is trying to find some way to get themselves onto that smartphone. Or if your business is software, do you have a good solid way to distribute updates to that software? Or can you push it out? Do you have to burn CDs or DVDs and then mail them out and they get damaged in transit? But you don't have sufficient capacity on your own servers, or you don't want people coming into your own into your own network to pick up information. So delivering software on demand is another feature where people often turn to cloud computing. Analyzing data. And this is an area where a lot of small businesses, they can't even really get into the game, because the amount of data that has to be stored to get sufficient information to analyze properly, to create predictions for where your industry is going. Do you have that capability? And again, if you need to do yearly analysis, but you don't need that kind of analysis for the rest of the year, what do? Do you shut down current services so that you can utilize them temporarily for some heavy-duty analysis? How do you handle that? Or do you just do without, which is what a lot of small businesses do? So these are just some of the opportunities for cloud computing. And what I'm going to really concentrate on, because Azure is a really big service, it's got lots and lots and lots of options available to it. We're going to deal a little bit with the developer and the app platform, but I'm not a developer. So other than giving you the infrastructure side of what services we're providing to your developers, I'm not going to be that much help there. With the data analytics, we're going to talk a little bit about the analytics, but mostly in reference. The Internet of Things, this is going to be, well, obviously is the next big thing. Not only are we trying to get onto everybody's phone, but now we're trying to get into everybody's house. And if you've got a business that has any application at all, Azure has some really interesting options that can actually help you if you're developing some of the Internet of Things kind of software or even hardware that needs software support, that needs cloud support. But mainly we're going to be taking a look at the traditional IT, because that's where I've been most of my professional life. So the cloud infrastructure is largely what we're going to take a look at today, and the advantages of that. But of course, all of this is running in the same service. So the advantages that we get in the traditional infrastructure being transmitted or transported over into the cloud, a lot of those same benefits are going to apply to those other areas that we're not going to deal with as much. So with Azure, Microsoft has decided to break things down into different areas. And so the compute area is where we create virtual machines, We have networking available the networking that supports the compute area. We've got actually the remote app. I needed to update this. The remote app feature is not a Microsoft feature any longer. That's Citrix, and Microsoft has turned that over, although that feature is still available, but that's available through a third party. Containers, which is a brand new idea that actually has some real advantages for speed of running up an application, and we'll talk about that one a little bit more. In security and management, or security and identity is actually is the label that they use there. If you are producing objects in the cloud, then your identities, in order to be used effectively with those cloud-based applications, are also, at least in the Azure environment, need to be cloud-based. So there is Azure Active Directory. It's not exactly the same as traditional Active Directory. You can link the two together. There's actually no charge for the basic functionality of Active Directory, but that allows you to have a separate clientele, if you will, in the cloud, separate from, but can also include your internal Active Directory or whatever directory that you're using. Even if you're not using Microsoft Active Directory, it's actually possible to synchronize part or all of your employee base or your internal users out into the cloud, and then mix in or keep separate cloud identities for customers, let's say, or for partner corporations. And if the partners happen to be in Azure or in Office 365, they actually already have identities, and you can federate with them. Multi-factor authentication, which Microsoft gives away for free. One of the things that you're going to see in the cloud is, Microsoft initially, there was a charge for almost everything. And then they started to think about it and realized, hey, security is a shared process. We're responsible for keeping the data centers secure. We're responsible for keeping the services that we're responsible for secure. But if our users aren't practicing, if the companies that buy and move into the cloud, if they're not practicing good security, then there is no security for anybody. And so Microsoft makes Azure Active Directory free, although there are add-ons that give you extra features that do have some cost associated with them, but creating the user accounts and managing them in the cloud is free. Multi-factor authentication. Initially, Microsoft was selling that. They decided, no, they needed to give you the tools that you need to make yourself as secure as you can. In fact, right before we went live, I went ahead and loaded up my portal on the computer that I'm on, which is not my normal computer. And I forgot I have multi-factor turned on. And so I actually had to go scramble around and find my phone, because the only way I can actually log into my portal in Azure is if I have my phone handy, and I use my phone as the multi-factor authentication. But that means if you try and guess a password to get into any of the objects that I've created in Azure, good luck with that. Unless you've also got my phone, there's no way that you're going to get your hands on it. And I can secure the phone with a lock screen and a PIN, where you're not going to see anything unless you also have my PIN. There are other options that are available, and there are some additional features that are available at extra cost. But Microsoft needs you to be secure. And so you have the option of turning on the basic features of multi-factor for free. There's automation that's available. And a relatively new feature, Microsoft allows you to manage keys that are used for encryption, or in fact, even for your secure communications, are now kept separate from the rest of your data. They're not being stored necessarily. They can be stored on your virtual machines if you want them to be, or they can be secured separately in the key vault. And we're gonna take a little bit more of a look at that. For storage, another thing that people just need, they may not need a virtual machine, they may not need anything directly active, they just need storage, and they need storage that's highly available and highly secure. So Microsoft has several options on storage. You can store blob content, that could either be audio video type of content, or it could be hard disks. The virtual hard disks that are used for virtual machines are actually stored as blob storage. You can store actual files, and if you're using server message block 3, which means you're using the newer versions of Microsoft operating systems, you can actually access those files as if they were any other file share, but now they're available to you directly over the cloud. Now you see Azure Files Services actually represented by Microsoft's software as a service offering of OneDrive, and OneDrive, which is also part of Office 365, where you can sync files directly to your machine, or you can just access them directly through a web interface. There are other types of storage that Microsoft has available. Practically every type of database server is available either on a virtual machine in Azure. Actually, everything is available as a virtual machine that can be run on a virtual machine. But Microsoft also offers platform as a service, where they run SQL servers that all you have to do is configure the database and then upload the actual data. They have others. MySQL databases can be created directly in storage accounts in Azure. One of the things that we've been seeing over the last couple of years is Microsoft becoming much more open and much more inviting to open source. Containers, for instance, originally was a Linux environment. Microsoft has now extended that with Server 2016 into the Windows environment, but you still have the capability in Azure of working with Linux machines as containers or Windows machines as containers. Both of those are supported. Microsoft has become much more friendly to the open source environment. And in fact, you could run in Azure and be completely open source if you want to. And that may have, if you're currently using that internally, now you have an opportunity to actually migrate that out into Microsoft's Azure cloud. On networking, some of the advantages that Microsoft has. If now this one is an extra cost, you can keep your connection into Azure, in fact, even into Office 365, completely on dedicated leased lines using Microsoft's ExpressRoute service. You can configure virtual private network connectivity over the public internet into Azure services. Microsoft has built-in load balancing inside of their Azure service. I actually just got done with an Office 365 class, and that class ends up with talking about implementing federation using Active Directory federation. And one of the things that you have to watch out for there is, if you decide to do federation, you have to make sure that your federation service and your internal domain controllers are available 24/7, because you could end up with a situation where all of your data is perfectly available in the cloud, but none of your users can authenticate any longer because your data center is not available. And so how do you manage that? How do you implement high availability? And if you were using Active Directory Federation services, in order to do high availability right, you need about 12 computers, could be virtual machines, but you also need some load balancing between four sets of those machines if you're doing the high availability right. And unfortunately, while you could do it on the cheap, there are big compromises there. And what you end up doing is having to purchase hardware network load balancers to make everything work perfectly well, and that can get rather expensive. Whereas in Azure, and by the way, you have the opportunity of hosting your federation servers in Azure, the load balancing is built in. It's part of the services that are available to you. Microsoft can host your public DNS. Now, they currently don't have the ability to register internet domains, but if you've got an internet domain that's already registered, who's handling your DNS? Are they available worldwide? You can actually migrate your DNS to Microsoft's worldwide DNS service. That's especially a good idea if you already have most of your web resources already running in the cloud. Having a worldwide distributed DNS cloud service makes a ton of sense. traffic manager and content distribution networks. Now, the CDN's not listed here. I have it listed a little bit later on. Allow you to have your information cached or made available worldwide. Content distribution network allows you to cache it worldwide if needed. Traffic manager allows you to have a mechanism where services that you're offering, and the services don't even have to be in the cloud, but typically they would be, are made available worldwide with a preference for certain areas getting more of the workload, or a preference for response times. Totally up to you to configure. In hybrid operations, you may have a lot of investment in your current data centers, and you don't want to, or you don't have the capability of packing those all up and moving them into the cloud. So Microsoft has the capability of setting up a hybrid cloud with you, and that with Active Directory would be Azure Active Directory Connect and the AD Connect Health, which monitors that situation. Privileged identity management, backup to the cloud, operational insights. Microsoft has the ability to, I like to call it, or I love to call it, System Center in the sky. Microsoft's Intune service, which is a full software as a service package, and operations management suite. Some of OMS is actually free, depending on how big you are. You may be able to utilize some of those services at no extra cost, but you're probably going to end up purchasing some of the services to get the full benefit of it. Import-export service. One of the issues that you're going to run into is if you do decide to migrate up to the cloud, how do I get my current load of data there? You can upload it over your internet connection, but then do you need extra bandwidth for that? And is that going to be a problem? Or Microsoft has a hard drive shipping service where you can load up your data onto a hard drive. The hard drive is protected with BitLocker. You separately transmit the BitLocker key to Microsoft, and then you overnight the hard disk. So you actually could get away where you don't even need the extra bandwidth during your migration. Microsoft Store Simple to make your data highly available through the cloud, and then site recovery, where you can have everything that physical and virtual in your current data center backed up to the cloud, or have the backups and the recovery managed through the cloud. Your choice on that one. Whichever way you would prefer to do it, you can actually have physical resources backed up into Azure and then deployed when needed to an alternate data center, or back to the original data center if you wanted it to, or you could deploy those resources as virtual machines inside of your Azure environment. And all of this, you look at all of this and go, okay, this is all great. There's lots and lots of services here, but what's the cost of all of this? How is this going to play out? So actually, with keeping in mind these key scenarios that a lot of organizations have already virtualized, so one of the easy buttons is, let's migrate our virtual machines up to a cloud service like Azure. And Microsoft makes it easy to quickly deploy and manage virtual machines, or to migrate virtual machines, whether they're Hyper-V or whether they're VMware, can be migrated up to the cloud. In some cases, you actually use the site recovery service because it's such a good service. It gets used as a relatively inexpensive, if you will, and easy to use migration tool. You can just back up and then restore it into the cloud. What's the difference between that and actually doing a quote migration? And the answer is there isn't any. That's one of the ways you can migrate. Maybe you have websites that you're currently hosting, but that's killing you in performance and bandwidth. So let's move or create websites up in the cloud where, hey, they're highly available. They're already on the internet. Why should I have the internet come to me when I can just put them directly on the internet, basically plug directly in? And then, as we said, data backup is available, as is disaster recovery using the site recovery service. So those are the main scenarios that I'm thinking of. And so we're going to look at some of the benefits of Azure. First of all, what are the cost benefits that I should be able to realize? Although you've got to be careful, there are some gotchas that you have to watch out for. What about speed? How fast is this gonna be? And if I put it in my own data center, I completely control the speed. Well, it turns out in Azure, for the most part, you also completely control the speed. So we'll talk about that. Of course, Azure is a global service, so we'll take a look at some of the information about that. What are some of the things that Microsoft has done to help you with your productivity? What about security? We'll just scratch the surface on that one. And then reliability has to be mentioned also, because of course keeping things secure but not available, there's no fun in that. That's actually violating one of the big tenets of security. So first of all, what about cost? And where I like to start here is, what is it costing you now to do IT, quote IT? All right, so we're talking about not completely retiring your data center, but we are talking about relieving a lot of the things that your data center does. You're still going to have communications. In fact, you're going to end up beefing up communications. So there is a bit of a negative cost there, because you will have to make sure that your communications out to the internet are more robust than they are now. So that actually is one of the negative sides of things. But let's talk about what you're going to be able to stop having to pay for. And the first thing is capital expenses. How much does it cost to actually implement a data center in one of your buildings, or to implement a data center off-site, or in most cases you're having to do both of those so that you have redundancy. So what's the cost of operating the physical location of your multiple data centers? And you know as well as I do, often there are secondary data centers that exist just for resilience, not for any other purpose. Although if you're large enough, you can often play off your data centers that you need anyway to get redundancy. But what's the cost of the actual physical plant? You have to pay rent on that square footage. Could you give up that square footage? Could you repurpose it for something else if you don't need it to house all the racks of servers that you need? What about the hardware itself? And here's where the cloud can really, really shine. Think about it. Every time you decide that you need to implement a new service, you also have to purchase additional hardware in most cases in order to support the extra load that you're taking on. But it's not just the hardware that you're purchasing. You have to sit and think about, what is the usable lifespan of that hardware that I'm about to purchase? If I purchase hardware that meets my needs today, but is not going to meet my needs 3 or 5 years from now when I'm still using the hardware, what good is that hardware? So you're going to end up having to right size your hardware for its end of life requirements, not for its beginning of life. So you're having to overbuy your hardware right now so that it will still be sufficient 3 to 5 years from now when you get ready to retire it. Now, we can offset some of that. That was some of the ideas behind introducing blade servers, and then ultimately by going to virtualization, we can offset some of that. In fact, with virtualization, you can offset a lot of that, but you don't want to purchase something that's only going to be good for a year, and then you're going to have to repurpose it someplace else just because it's not big enough to handle the load anymore. So you end up in almost every instance overbuying, spending a lot more now than you needed to, unless you've got a good way to expense it out over the life of the hardware, which a lot of us do. We lease the hardware. That way we don't have to worry about that initial cost. But how much is that leasing costing you as opposed to an outright purchase of the information? You have to buy the software that goes on there, and that's not a trivial cost. You have to buy the media. If you're going to run something locally, then you also have to be backing it up locally. You have to be backing it up off-site. If we weren't using a cloud service, or we weren't using an off-site service, then you certainly need to supply the media. And of course, in the hardware, that's going to be represented by your hard drives. But for backup, what are you doing about media? And then there's the storage of the media, and you have to maintain the security of that extra media. I'm reminded a couple years ago, my eldest daughter graduates from college, and then 2 years later gets a letter from one of her loan providers saying, we're missing a backup disk. We're not exactly sure where it is, but it had your information on it, and because we can't find it, we're going to pay for 2 years of fraud detection, because we're sure it didn't get lost, we just can't find it. So not only is there the cost of the media, but there's also the cost of the security and the management of all of that. What are you paying for redundancy and high availability? Number one, if we just go back to the physical plant, what is it costing you to have redundant power? How much are all those batteries or that generator, or both, that you're doing? Or do you just put a bunch of solar panels on the roof and hope that you have sunshine whenever your power disaster hits? Down here in the South, we're paying a fortune for cooling. Maybe that's not as bad up in the North, except during the summer. But you gotta get rid of all of that heat that all of that equipment is generating. So how much are you paying for cooling? And oh, by the way, how much are you paying for the redundant cooling? Why not throw that off on your cloud provider? What about redundant communications? You need to make sure that if there's an outage in your primary communications, that there's sufficient bandwidth in your backup communications to keep servicing everything. Or do you just limp along with some greatly reduced? And again, when I first started out, I was in a really small business, and we eventually worked our way up to a DSL line. And my high availability was, I had a couple of modems that I could bind together and get two dial-up the bandwidth of two 56K dial-ups as my failover communications. And darned if I didn't have to use it from time to time. But they sure would notice it. I'd start getting those phone calls about gee, everything's got a lot slower. And we're talking about like even before the internet was a thing, but networking was just coming out, and you still would notice the difference between like a T1. Well, actually, T1 comes along later on. But some of that early communications technology that was actually better bandwidth and more highly reliable, but still would suffer from issues, especially if you were a small business. And then what are you spending to manage all of that? You're having to employ people like me to come in and set up those servers. At heart, I'm a hardware guy. That's where I started. I literally got my first job because I built those servers and I built those computers, and then I had to learn how to manage them, how to manage the software on them, because what good were they if you could build them if you couldn't actually make them run? So I eventually get dragged into IT management because I could do all of that. But what does it cost you to employ a team of people like that? Just in the outright cost of the care and feeding of that zoo. And then what about the management and overhead? Those are employees that you have to pay for. You have to pay for their managers. You have to pay for all of the associated overhead. And there's a lot more. That's just scratching the surface on the cost. So how does Azure help you offset that? Well, all of your infrastructure costs are included in the pricing, and most of the services, I like to say, are billed. You pay by the pound, and literally you pay by the minute. So if you've got a service that you don't need as much capacity in the middle of the night, overnight, you're not paying for that capacity if you set it up correctly. Now, you do have to pay for somebody to manage the cloud. That's true. But in most cases, your developers, and Microsoft has certainly tuned this that way, your developers are going to end up managing. So you've already got that team of people, or you're going to repurpose some of your internal people from your internal data center to taking care of the cloud. But in a lot of cases, the developers are going to end up taking over. But look at SQL Server with Microsoft. I used to be SQL Server certified because SQL Server back in 2000 and prior to that was run on the infrastructure side of things. And then Microsoft realized, hey, why don't we just turn it over to the developers? They're in there anyway, and a lot of people are doing custom management of their databases. And so after 2000, your infrastructure people are no longer managing, for the most part. If you follow Microsoft's recommendation, it's your developers that are taking over the management of it. So all almost all of these costs, not all of them, but almost all of these costs are rolled into the per minute pricing, the per pound pricing. And you're going to see Microsoft actually makes a way available to you that you can actually have your costs shrink when you're not busy and then grow when you do get busy in response to either, scheduled time or in response to the actual load. So most of the services that you're going to end up using are billed by the minute. So now you're not having to pay for all that hardware that's going to be available to you throughout its 3 to 5 year lifespan or longer if you're, especially if it's a small business. You're paying by the pound, by the minute for what you need. And it grows as you grow. So you set up the features, and if you look at it as hardware, because everything ultimately is run on hardware, the hardware that you get today in Azure is sufficient for the load. You choose that, not Microsoft. You choose what sort of performance characteristics that you need, but you choose what you need today, and then you either manage it manually or you can manage it automatically where it gets larger or it migrates over to larger equipment, or how how it actually gets implemented is different depending on the service that you buy. So Microsoft likes to call it pay as you grow, not pay everything up front like you would typically end up doing if you were running your own data center. You can choose to offset your costs by also offsetting some of the redundancy. There are 4 levels of redundancy in their storage accounts, and since the storage account tends to be the basis for most of the other services, that kind of rules how much or how quickly your information is available. But just as a basis, almost every Microsoft service has a 99.9% guaranteed monthly uptime, and Microsoft actually has started to guarantee 99.95 on most of the services because they've been able to achieve that over the last couple of years, pretty much across the board. But you can actually do better than that with some of the redundancy choices that you have. But you can choose to offset resilience with some of the cost, and you do that internally. I mean, you always have to make that value judgment. You have the ability to make that same value judgment in the cloud. You have the ability to pay as you go, pay just for what you set up when you set it up. As soon as you tear it back down again and delete it, then you're not paying for it anymore. You can save some money by signing an enterprise agreement with Microsoft that includes not just your on-premises, but also your cloud services. There are discounts that Microsoft has made available, and these are relatively new. Reserved instances, which apply directly to virtual machines, but can also apply. Some of the other services that Microsoft offers are actually based on virtual machines, even though you don't set up a virtual machine. You can choose to pre-purchase a 3-year contract for a virtual machine at a greatly reduced price. Hybrid benefits, if you currently have software assurance with Microsoft. Now, this one is really interesting because one of the things that you run into when you first move into Azure or into any cloud service for that matter is there is an initial extra cost involved because you've already paid for your data center, and so you're already eating those costs. So when you first move into the cloud, you're now paying what's left of your data center costs while also taking on new costs. Well, with the hybrid benefits, if you have software assurance for features that exist both in your data center and in the cloud, there is a 40% discount for the virtual machines. And again, there's some of the other services that also are based on virtual machines, even though you don't set them up as virtual machines. And there's a 40% discount for your software assurance that you're already paying for in your data center as you move into the cloud. And the cool thing is you can stack both of those discounts. So in some cases, I believe the example they give you, if you click on, and you're going to get this PowerPoint, and these are all clickable links. You can see they're all showing up as hyperlinks. So you can go directly into some of this information. You can stack the reserved instances on top of hybrid benefits, and I believe the example that Microsoft gives you is actually with their SQL database service, it ends up with an 82% discount off of you just buying it outright. And there's variation in that. So that's going to be one of their best case scenarios. Also, Microsoft has free services. I already mentioned that Azure Active Directory, the basic functionality is totally free. Multi-factor authentication is free in its basic form. You can buy up and get extra features in there. But their web apps, there are a slew of free sizes that you can just set up and run. Now, there's limitations on how much activity you can generate. There's limitations on how resilient they are, but they're free. And in a lot of cases, Microsoft is promoting that to schools so that students can learn about how to program, how to create apps, and they could actually distribute an app that a few of their friends have on their phones and manage it for free through Azure. But your developers can use those same free resources. But in addition to that, Microsoft has discounted pricing for development or test environments so that you're not having to go ahead and pay full freight for something that you're just testing things out on and developing your applications on. So that's available to you. There's a pricing calculator that you can just go in and say, okay, I need this size of virtual machine. I'm going to need to run it this long. If it's scalable, this is how it's going to scale out. And you can come up with a pretty good estimate of how much it's going to cost. Although I will warn you, a lot of people don't understand all of the features that are available with something that they're pricing, and they end up underestimating their pricing. So you do have to have a good understanding of whatever service or product that you're looking at in Azure before you run the calculator, although the calculator tries to help you out. And then brand new, just came out of preview, cost management, which is Microsoft throughout the years, they eat some of their kids, if you will. As you know, Microsoft is not a totally monolithic operation. There are plenty of partner companies, including New Horizons, which is a partner for learning with Microsoft. But occasionally, one of the partners comes up with something so good that Microsoft just buys that company and rolls it in. SysInternals was one of those. The guys over at SysInternals probably understood Windows better than Microsoft did, which is kind of weird if you think about it. So they just outright bought them. And cost management was a partner provided, a third-party application that could help you manage both upsizing and downsizing your resources in Azure. And Microsoft bought it to give it away for free. Everybody who's got an Azure account can now can go to the cost management portal and actually have it actively monitor your services in Azure and shrink them back down again when they no longer need to have the capacity that you've set them up for. If they are a scalable service. Now, you got to watch out for that because some of the products are not scalable. They typically have much less cost associated with them. The scalable products typically have a larger initial cost pound for pound, but they're scalable so they can get bigger and they can get smaller as it goes along. Free, so you could help manage your own cost. All right. On the speed side of things, everything in Azure is self-service. You have the portal, you have PowerShell, and oh, by the way, there's a new version of PowerShell that Microsoft has just rolled out. The new PowerShell works on Macs and it works on Linux boxes, and that was in a lot of ways that was necessary as Microsoft has become a much more open source in their cloud offering. You needed ways to be able to manage consistently across your Windows environment, your Linux environment, and if you have a Mac environment. So now the new PowerShell actually can be utilized. The PowerShell that you've learned or invested in learning can now be utilized across all of the major operating systems, not just left with inside of Windows. But even before the new version of PowerShell was released, Microsoft had the command line interface in Azure, which would allow you to have similar commands for both Windows and Linux. And in fact, for the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time in classes saying, look, if you're in an environment where you're going to be using Linux, then learn the command line interface if you don't already know PowerShell, because that will apply to both areas. Now I can say, look, there's PowerShell, there's a lot of information about it, but now it can apply to both Windows and to Linux, the Linux environment. Microsoft has offerings in infrastructure as a service where you set up your virtual machines effectively. There's platform as a service, where Microsoft runs the underlying virtual machines. It's totally up to them. All you need to do is, for example, deploy your SQL database or your MySQL database into the platform as a service offering that Microsoft has. And then the third option is software as a service, for instance, Office 365. If you need to implement a SharePoint server, you could implement your SharePoint server on a VM. In fact, there are templates. There are SharePoint server virtual machine templates that you can just say, I want one of those, and here's how many CPUs it gets, here's how much RAM it gets, and bingo, it gets set up in your infrastructure in the virtual machine offering in Azure. Or you could buy SharePoint Online from Microsoft, or you can buy Office 365, which includes SharePoint Online. So you purchase, or you have the option of purchasing any one of those to get the speed that you need, the performance that you need, or offset the speed of setting it all up. And in some of their services, there's that middle area where you have the platform as a service. If you want to set up a website, if you need complete and absolute control over everything about that website, then you have the ability to set up a virtual machine and and it doesn't have to be a Windows virtual machine. It could be an Apache server running on Linux. It could be an IIS server running on a Windows version if you want to, but that lets you have complete control over that virtual machine. You don't have control over the underlying Hyper-V server, but that usually does not cause too many effects. You have the ability to do that. Or you can get the platform as a service web app offering from Microsoft, or the mobile app offering from Microsoft. And there you do have some restrictions, but there are some easy to use scalability built into that system. If you're running virtual machines, scalability is up to you to provide it. With the platform as a service web app offering, that scalability is actually built into it. There's the cloud service, which gives you a multi-tier web application that you can use, where both tiers are scalable, and there's some variation on that. Or once again, you could just use SharePoint Online, where Microsoft gives it the speed in response to the load that it's encountering, but you don't control that as directly. It's faster to set up, but maybe you could get better performance out of having a little bit more control. If you currently have all of your services provided in your data center, Microsoft has several different mechanisms for you to set up a hybrid between your existing data center and Azure, and that's going to make it easier to transition those systems into the cloud, and faster, and reduce downtime. So there are hybrid scenarios that actually might make the speed of transition, and then ultimately the speed of performance, better. Thousands and thousands of templates, not just in virtual machines. When Microsoft a couple of years ago went from their Service Manager module, where you were responsible for setting up everything and you had to do it in the right order, into Resource Manager module. If I go into GitHub, for instance, let's see, I should open up GitHub. There we go. And this is just one of the examples. Oops, where did it disappear to? All right, so that's not going to work, and we're just about out of time. So GitHub has thousands of Microsoft-provided templates, but also user-provided templates, just for your virtual machines themselves. You can upload, if you come up with a really clever set of virtual machines, you can upload them and actually sell them through the Microsoft websites, through the Microsoft stores yourself. Okay, now I need to get this back on track. There we go. Scalable services. Not everything is scalable, but almost everything is. So you provide the speed that you need at the time that you need it. And so scalable services also offset the cost. Why have the biggest, baddest thing when you don't need it and reduce the cost, but you can have it when you want it, either time-wise or in response to the load, and you can scale up. You can also scale out depending on the service that you have, because some services respond better to scaling out additional copies of machines, of virtual machines, rather than bigger virtual machines. And then Microsoft has regional data centers worldwide. So if your users are located in other countries, you can base your information in those other locations so that you get better response times. You're not having to travel around the world to get access to your information. And then last, if literally you can set up a virtual machine. Microsoft says seconds. I'm kind of hard pressed to find one that I could set up in seconds. Although I'm certain it is possible with some of the lower mass operating systems. But containers, if you moved into containers, you can set up new applications in a container literally in seconds, in just a couple of seconds, where a virtual machine might take you a minute or two, and longer if it's got applications already loaded on it, because you actually have to copy it and then have to run it up and provision it. But with containers, literally seconds. And if you're running containers internally, you can set up a hybrid where you can just migrate them all up to the cloud. So that's a really cool speed feature. If you haven't checked out containers, that's something you need to look into. Of course, Microsoft is available globally, kind of already talking about it. So here's a shot of their current data centers. They have announced 50 regions worldwide, and when it comes to high availability and resilience, their regions are an interesting idea that we'll talk about. There's 140 countries ultimately that they're going to be in. They've got 38 last time I looked that are up and running. The rest of them are in process. The content distribution network that I talked about earlier, and the traffic manager that I talked about earlier, and Azure DNS, all features that you can use. For productivity, Microsoft allows your developers to use any development tool or any language that they're currently familiar with. So that actually, I originally had that listed under speed because you don't have to learn new tricks. Yeah, there's a little bit in there new, but largely your developers can keep using what they are using. Visual Studio, team services are supported. GitHub, Microsoft actually has the largest presence on GitHub. And for web applications, you have application insights and other monitoring tools built within Azure so you can keep an eye on things. There's over 100 services that are available in Azure. So you can do things yourself totally where you have complete control over them, or you can use the services that Microsoft has. End-to-end management, you're responsible. You don't have to ask anybody to do anything for you. You can do it all yourself, totally self-service through the Azure portal, through the Azure PowerShell, Azure command line, and you can custom code anything that you want using, again, any of the development languages that you already know. For migration tools, just released out of preview, Microsoft's Azure Migrate, and there is an Azure Migration Center where not only do you see what Microsoft has available for you, but you see what offerings are there from third parties, from Microsoft partner companies, in case you want to hire somebody who's done this before and has experience. And last, relatively new, but not that new, Azure Stack. You can actually run your own internal version of Azure, and that makes it even easier ultimately to migrate, because your Azure Stack can then seamlessly move your services from your own internal version of Azure out to the cloud or back again if you want to. So information on Azure Stack is in there. For security, mentioned it before, secure data centers, regularly updated. You control your own data. Microsoft does not data mine you. They've got Key Vault for keeping, so that you can keep your hands on your own encryption keys. Information protection. So you can have rights management and more than rights management to actually protect your information, not just files. And then the directory and multi-factor authentication. Azure policy, which is in preview right now, where you can have policies applied to your information in Azure. And there's a security center, the trust center, distributed denial of service protection available from Microsoft to make it easy for you, to make sure you've got good security, or to make it easy for you to find out information about compliance. The Security Center and the Trust Center are real easy to use tools that give you scores and let you know, well, Trust Center doesn't, but the Security Center does. It gives you a score so you know how well you're doing compared to a regular measuring stick. All right, well, gosh, I mean, it's Azure, it's huge. How can you talk about Azure in an hour, what the benefits are you, and I didn't make it. There's a couple more slides in here. If you're interested in any of these objects that we've talked about, when you get your hands on the slide deck, they're all links to everything that take you to the Microsoft information. Remember that Azure is free and there are free resources. Anybody can sign up, get $200 credit for 30 days. And if you just use free services, it continues to be free. To learn more, go to azuremicrosoft.com. Read the Azure blog, azuremicrosoft.com/ and if you just did blog, you'll get there. And of course, there's training from New Horizons, and there's a link that if you click that link, that'll give you all of our Azure courses just by clicking that link. All right, well, thanks for being here. I'm afraid I've got to run. I've got a plane to catch here. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. I know we went right up to the hour, so unfortunately we don't have time for any questions at this time, but lots of information and links in the PowerPoint presentation. You guys will all receive that later today, along with a link to view the session recording. So you guys will have all this information at your hands. Thank you again so much, Eric. Really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you everyone for joining us. That will conclude today's webinar. Please visit our website at newhorizons.com to register for any upcoming webinars or view past webinar recordings in our archive library. You can also find more information on our Microsoft Azure courses on our website at newhorizons.com as well. Thanks so much, everyone. That will conclude today's webinar. Have a great day.